Welcome to the Politics Guys. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. Today I'm joined by Trey, who recently became our third Politics Guy. Now, Trey's co-hosted with me a few times already, but today, for the first time, he's moving into the driver's seat. Our plan is for this to be a regular thing, with Trey doing the show once a month, usually with me, but maybe sometimes with Jay when I need a week off. And so if you have any thoughts about the new arrangement, we would certainly love to hear from you. Of course, you can email us at mail@politicsguys.com, post comments on our website, politicsguys.com, or reach us through our Facebook page, facebook.com/politicsguys page. And with that, I will turn things over to Trey.
Thanks, Mike. It's kind of fun to get to be doing your side of the task today.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think what we're going to kind of start out with today is the big news is we have Representative Scalia is shot this week. And this has led to a bunch of really fascinating questions. The shooter was James Hodgkins. He was 66, and he had a list of Republicans on his person. And so he's coming out. It looks like he is gunning for some Republicans, quite literally. He has a legally purchased gun, but pretty quickly it becomes apparent that he's, in fact, a Bernie Sanders supporter. And this has led to a lot of discussion on the left and the right about violence and the political discourse. On the left, we've got Democrats saying on Twitter, quote, "Let's cut through the platitudes. Anyone who participated in the unjust vilifications of Hillary Clinton helped toxify our discourse," all the way to George Takei talking about how it's the universe who makes a homophobe saved by a black lesbian. Meanwhile, on the Republican side, we have this new idea of the culture of violence that the Daily Caller called it just the latest in an escalating pattern of violence and intimidation against Republicans. The ever-reliable InfoWars said that we have been warning for months that the mainstream media's hysterical anti-Trump narrative will radicalize and demented social justice warriors on the left. And this fits into kind of a larger set of issues going on this week. So, Michael, what do you think about what's happened with the shooting and what it means politically on the left and the right?
Well, I'm not at all surprised that that was the response in many places on the right, because that's exactly the sort of response that we saw from the left when, the shoe was on the other foot, when the shooter was, perhaps more on the right side of things. And so,
like with Gabby Giffords, for instance.
Exactly. And so it's of course unfortunate that both sides try to politicize these things. But to me, I really see this as being part of two kind of larger, more fundamental problems. One of those you already mentioned, sort of deep partisan divisions, and the second one being kind of a gun culture that we've had and will continue to have in the United States. You add those things up together, you combine in a nice dollop, an unfortunate dollop of media sensationalism, and these sort of things sadly end up happening.
Well, it's been fascinating because this go round, it doesn't seem as if gun control has really been the main focus. At least in the primary discourse, it's been about kind of the bounds and the necessities of the First Amendment. So what do you think about that from the left perspective?
Well, I guess I'm a little bit surprised that we don't hear more about that. But then again, I think after Sandy Hook, after all these shootings, if nothing was going to happen from them, and nothing did really significantly happen, at least not at the federal level, that becomes almost kind of a dead letter in a way, is that we're not going to move forward on that. We're not going to change the gun culture in the United States. We're not going to do a thing like, say, Australia did after their major shooting a while back. And so that's not going to happen. And, I guess one of the frustrating things to me about this entire situation is I don't really see that we can do a whole heck of a lot about either part of this. We're not going to change the gun culture. There aren't going to be any major alterations in our gun laws, at least at the federal level. So there's always going to be that access, at least for the short and intermediate term future. And secondly, there's nothing that I see on the horizon that's going to do anything to mitigate, to lessen either the partisan divisions or the sensationalism in the media that sort of feeds mentally disturbed people on both the right and the left who end up doing these things. So I'm very pessimistic on both sides of this, I guess.
Well, it's fascinating because I think one of the interesting things for me is it kind of capped off a week where we were already having this conversation. Online, we'd even had some conversations with listeners about the New York Public Theater's production of Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, where we had already had this kind of argument that the way we were portraying the use of free speech was negative coming from the right, or Kathy Griffin and the bloodied model of Donald Trump's head, which kind of had the backlash on both sides. I mean, do you think that those are kind of feeding into a narrative that is chipping away at First Amendment rights, or do you think this is just kind of the normal posturing that comes after any event like this?
Yeah, I think it's largely the kind of normal posturing. I sort of have a larger thought about, you mentioned the Kathy Griffin thing, and I'm glad you did, because I think that's kind of part of a larger piece with a lot of this. But before we get to that, I just want to make sure that we thank our first sponsor for today's show, SeatGeek. I've been told that actually they've been a sponsor for a little while now, and apparently my pronunciation sometimes a little off. SeatGeek. I sometimes don't enunciate my T's. My wife tells me, and so listeners who pointed that out, sorry about that. But let me tell you, SeatGeek, they're a great, low cost, super convenient way to buy tickets for live events. And with SeatGeek, you can find the best seats at the best prices, fully guaranteed, and it only takes either a few taps on the app or a few clicks if you access it through their website, SeatGeek.com. And I've got the app, and it gives me all sorts of recommendations that are tailored specifically to my musical interests. Like just yesterday, the app let me know that James McMurtry was coming to Cincinnati, and he's someone I'd love to see. And if SeatGeek hadn't told me about him, I would have completely missed that opportunity to see him. Plus, with SeatGeek, you get updates on whatever venues, events, performers you'd like to keep track of. It will even hook up with Spotify, your music library, Facebook to kind of give you notifications about artists you listen to. But if you don't want that, you can turn that off too. And when you buy a ticket, they'll even put the day and time of the event on your calendar if you want. So it's super convenient. And best of all, Politics Guys listeners get $20 off their first SeatGeek purchase. All you have to do is download the SeatGeek app and enter promo code Politics Guy. That's all one word and no S. Why? I don't know, but just Politics Guy. Enter that, and that promo code will give you $20 off your first SeatGeek purchase. Okay, so yeah, on to my answer that, the Kathy Griffin thing, and that to me is an example of we've always had, I think, extreme people like this. And I think that it's just our culture. Social media allows these things to go viral and to be magnified, and makes, what would be a minor thing much worse. Now, obviously, the shooting, that's a whole different thing. But I think that people like this guy, they get fed by this sort of vitriol, which is so easily channeled and focused, and so people can get worked up in a way today that I don't think they could to the same extent before social media and so forth. And so that to me is the truly disturbing thing about all this. Is I don't see this going away. And I know Mark Zuckerberg has made some noises about how Facebook can change and so forth, but that's not the business model. That's not the incentives. These platforms are designed to give us more of what we want, to affirm our views, to get us worked up and outraged. And that business model is not going to change. And so I don't have any good answers to this. These things are obviously, horrible and tragic, but I'm honestly sometimes surprised that we don't see more of this sort of awful stuff.
And that's interesting because I mean, there was a theory back when talk radio became big. I don't know if you've ever read um, a book called Echo Chamber, which would argue basically that when you started getting in, and they were specifically talking about new media in terms of radio being kind of a new form of an old media. Then you got into these echo chambers, and you were able to kind of get hyper partisanized, and that's how you would end up with, well, they wouldn't have called it Alex Jones, but today would be considered Alex Jones. I mean, is that kind of what you're arguing here?
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And it's just gotten worse, obviously, with the ascendancy of social media in the last whatever decade or so. And I don't, and that's the thing, is I don't see that changing. I don't see any reason why it would change if we rely on people's better natures or appeals to, I don't know, decency or something like that. That's not going to work. I mean, this exploits a basic fundamental feature of human psychology, for the worse, I would certainly argue. And and that's part of the reason why we started this show in the first place, to try to push back against that. But it's incredibly difficult because people want to be outraged and want to be worked up and want their views to be affirmed. And I know you're familiar with the research that says that you put people in with a group of like-minded folks and it tends to actually make them more radical. And that's exactly what we're getting, unfortunately.
And and here's a problem, and I don't have an answer for this. But one of the things that I think is fascinating, anybody who wants to geek out on this, maybe we can do it more sometime. But once we start kind of making that argument, you're really kind of pulling out some of the pillars of democracy.
Yeah. Oh no. Yeah.
um, because you're what we're arguing then in that case is that the average person in these kinds of environments won't be able to make the informed best kind of decision, and that of course is one of the major pillars of a Republican or a Democratic system of government. So I mean, when we start talking about this, do we ever need to back up and ask, what are we talking about to the larger theoretical structures of our government? What do you think, Mike?
No, I mean, I think that's a very real threat. Survey data kind of backs this sort of thing up, where we're showing that more and more people see the other party actually not as just misguided, but as a real threat to the country, of bad people who are trying to destroy the country. And that didn't used to be the case. And you take a look at, all kinds of survey data, and it's pretty clear that that's what's going on, and nobody has any good answers for halting that. And so and I don't mean to get, I'm not a sensationalist by nature. I tend to think that the system has a remarkable ability to self-correct and to heal itself. But this sort of tribalism that we seem to be going back into, this sort of almost pre-industrial tribalism, it makes me wonder, we have this fundamental assumption of progress, that the future is always going to be better than the past and that we're going to come together and so forth. But if you take a look at the broader sweep of history, that isn't necessarily the case. And as much as I'd like to think that this is just sort of a blip, uh, I don't, I think I'm kind of hoping against hope in a way, because all the evidence to me points to this not being a blip, but the things actually getting a lot worse before they get better in this sense. Wow, I'm
No, it is
depressed.
fascinating. I think you're right that there's often, and it's easy to have that teleologically flawed view that you're always moving towards this ultimate endpoint, and that ultimate endpoint is going to be better. And I don't know if I'm quite, maybe in this case, maybe ironically, I'm not quite maybe as pessimistic as you, but I definitely agree that it can be easy to kind of get into that model where you think everything has to move in one direction. It's going to get better. And I think especially for people on the left, there's been this idea that, and you were kind of hinting at it there, that tribalism or that nationalism is going to be a thing of the past. And I don't think that that's a cultural feature that's going away anytime soon. And I think it kind of feeds into our conversation here about media. But while we're kind of talking about nations, nationalisms, and where we're headed, why don't we talk a little bit about the Cuba restrictions?
Yeah,
Um,
definitely.
Sound good?
Yeah, yeah. Before we do, though, let me just mention our second sponsor for today's show, longtime sponsor, Dollar Shave Club, which delivers an amazing smooth shave, and you can get high quality blades and that amazing shave butter delivered right to your door for an incredible smooth shave. And Father's Day pretty much here right now, but if you forgot or you want to get Dad, a little late, but Father's Day gift, what would be better than a membership to Dollar Shave Club? I think that'd be pretty cool. I've said it before. I went away from razors. I hated the high cost, the inconvenience, going to the store, paying a ridiculous amount of money for the cartridges, tried the cheap plastic disposable things. That was a bloody disaster. And so Dollar Shave Club solved all of these problems for me. It can do the same thing for you too. And for a limited time, New members get their first month of the Executive Razor, a tube of their Dr. Carver shave butter, which is great stuff for only $5, and that's with free shipping. And after that, razors are just a few dollars a month. It's a $15 value for only $5. And in that first month's box, you get this really nice weighty handle, a full cassette of 4 executive cartridges, and a tube of shave butter. And you can only get this offer now. Go to dollarshaveclub.com/TPG. That's dollarshaveclub.com/TPG. Okay, so you were saying Cuba.
Yes, Cuba. Although I have to say that that actually is a phenomenal deal,
Yeah, absolutely,
and
definitely.
everybody should do it. But no, Cuba. In Cuba, we've had a huge change of policy announced this past Friday. So kind of set up our listeners a little bit. Starting in 2004, Obama had announced that he wanted to normalize relations with Cuba. And by March 2016, Obama is going to make a pretty historic trip. He'll be the first president in 88 years to visit the island. And he is going to have a big policy shift. And importantly, this policy shift is going to come exclusively through executive authority to allow for people to people educational trips. And it wiped away most of the stiff commercial restrictions and allowed the use of dollar transactions in Cuba. And so this past Friday, President Trump called this, quote, a terrible and misguided deal, end quote, and vowed to reinstate the travel and commercial restrictions. As a matter of fact, he was supported by this and by one of my senators, Senator Marco Rubio, who has been at the forefront of pushing for more restrictive Cuba policies ever since 2014. And what ended up getting signed by Trump wasn't exactly a complete kill for the Obama year. It's still possible to use dollars for transactions in Cuba, but his 6-page document will and hinder much of money coming in, especially if they're doing anything, quote, controlled by the Cuban military, and it walls off crucial parts of the economy. It also ends completely the people-to-people educational trip, but it doesn't stop Cuban Americans from continuing to send money to the island. Senior White House officials have argued that the intent was not to disrupt existing business relationships. But on the business side, it seems like many people are a little bit upset about this. As a matter of fact, Airbnb was pretty upset about this. And so there's been a little bit of pushback, but a lot of happiness from some quarters, including from those like Marco Rubio and a number of other senators who are happy to kind of see a return to what some have called Cold War era relationship. What do you think about all this, Mike?
Well, that I was in favor of Obama opening up relations with Cuba. And as you pointed out, it's so often with Donald Trump, he's rhetorically making a bigger case than what's actually happening in reality. It's not entirely unwinding all the Obama, what I see as progress. We still have embassies, and it's still possible to go there, and it's still possible for Cubans to send money home and do things like that. But I guess that the main thing that people might wonder is, why is this so big of a deal? Because Cuba, right, is a very small, very poor country. It's only like around 3.5% the size of the US in terms of population. Its GDP is tiny, like 0.5% of US GDP. Why do we care so much? And in a word, your home state, Florida, right? Because Cuba has an outsized importance especially in South Florida, which, by the way, Trump won by just 1.2%. And so, I mean, this to me is an example of kind of domestic politics driving foreign policy in a way. If Florida didn't have, 29 electoral votes and wasn't the biggest swing state in presidential politics really right now, I don't think this would be nearly the issue. In fact, I think we would have had much more normalized relations much earlier. But again, because of presidential politics, that's not the case. So, but yeah, I disagree with pulling back on this. I mean, I think the Castros have outlasted a lot of American presidents, and we have kind of demonstrated that our unilateral sanctions embargo against Cuba has been largely ineffective. It hasn't worked. If it was going to work, it would have worked sometime in the last 50 or so years. it hasn't. And so President Obama decided to try something a little bit different. And I think that was a smart move. And I think that that eventually is going to lead to better relations. I mean, the Castros can't be around forever. Geez, Raul's got to be like 130 years old at this point, you know? So this is going to
Something like that.
change. And we want to set the groundwork to make that happen. And I don't think we do it by sticking with what I see as a failed policy.
No, and you started that off with something really interesting because there has been this fascinating differentiation with President Trump between his rhetoric and what ends up coming up on paper. Here, this is this terrible and misguided deal, but then he doesn't actually gut the whole thing, which in some ways kind of echoes some of his tweets earlier in the week when he kind of gets after his own White House for a travel ban that he thinks, well, this is all watered down. Like, why are
Yeah.
we doing that? Right. So he had this really strong rhetoric. He can't get through his quote unquote watered down version through. And you kind of wonder where in that, at least I do, where is Trump? So, I mean, is what he's saying what he really thinks, and he's not able to convince the rest of his staff effectively to make that happen? Or is this just him? Striking the best deal. You say one thing and then you put the next best thing on paper. I mean, is that what's happening here in Cuba? What do you think about that, Mike?
Well, I guess the positive spin, the most pro-Trump spin I can put on this, and I'm probably going to get some comments on this, but
You're,
let me,
you're you're thinking of the Twitter reaction now.
yeah,
Continue.
exactly. But I think one way to look at it is to say Donald Trump's actually doing a very smart thing. What he's saying is he's not the reason why he didn't pull back entirely on what Obama did is say it's a gambit, a strategy saying, listen, we're willing to kind of move forward, but you have to give us a better deal. So it's kind of like a very sophisticated, thoughtful carrot and stick kind of thing plan. But to me, that might be plausible if you talked about a different administration. But as somebody else suggested that I forget who said this, saying that everyone else is playing chess, but the Trump administration is playing checkers. That's kind of strategically where they're at, and to me, I think that there's a lot more evidence to suggest that. So you certainly can spin a story in which this is a very smart kind of looking 3 steps ahead strategic gambit, but I don't buy it. I see it more as just Florida's importance. Donald Trump loves to be loved, and he also wants to show that he's not Barack Obama, and so he's going to do this. I honestly don't think it goes a whole lot further than that.
It's interesting because from my libertarian perspective, these kinds of attempts to use economic sanctions as a way to force institutional change have long been demonstrated to be ineffective. I mean, it's not as if having more or less relationship with China somehow made them more or less democratic. I mean, I think the best argument you can make from the data is that by making your economic situation freer, that you at least create the best conditions possible for a more free political society. And so,
Yeah.
why having these big trade barriers? I mean, I'm not trying to suggest that if you open up trade with China, you instantaneously make them free, but I'm just suggesting that it's your best option for the best coalition of variables to make that move forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I think when sanctions are multilateral, there's a possibility of them having a real effect and changing things. But when it's just kind of us doing them and the rest of the world's ignoring that, that makes it a lot harder. And again, there's the evidence not just of the literature, right, but the evidence of Castro's in power and this regime in power for a long, long time that suggests that, hey, this strategy is a failure. And if we continue on, we shouldn't necessarily expect different results.
Yeah, and the thing that's particularly fascinating is, during the original Cold War, the original reason for holding this off was Cuba's considered basically a puppet state of the USSR.
Right.
Well, I mean, while Putin is not a good guy, he's obviously not putting nukes in Cuba, and they don't particularly have a phenomenal relationship. So it's not as if, as you're noting, they've been here post Russian propping. So obviously, this policy was unsuccessful.
Yeah. So I guess it sounds like we are definitely in agreement on this one.
Hey, that's a little bit crazy. I don't
Yeah, there
we've
you
ever been
go.
quite this much in agreement. Oh no. Anyway, what if we move forward and talk a little bit about Sessions' testimony this week? Because I think that was really big, especially coming after Comey last week. So Sessions is going to come and he is going to really have kind of a number of big points that he's going to drop. He's going to deny meeting with Russian officials at the Mayflower Hotel in April 2016. He is going to contest a bunch of what Comey is going to argue during his meeting, although he's going to agree with parts of it. The part he's going to agree with is that he did know that Comey didn't want to be alone with Trump anymore, but he didn't get any details. So he's going to kind of walk that back a little bit. Sessions is going to repeatedly refuse, and I think we might have something to talk about here for a while, Mike. His conversations with President Trump regarding the Russian investigation, arguing basically that it's consistent with longstanding Department of Justice practice, and that he won't violate his duty to protect confidential communication with the president. Democrats are going to push back strong and hard on this because they're going to argue that there has not been any executive privilege evoked. So we may want to chat about that. Um, he's also going to argue really that he doesn't remember a lot of things except for the fact that he didn't do anything illegal. So, what do you think about Sessions' testimony? How does this relate to what's happening in the wake of Comey's testimony? What do you think?
Well, the first thing I think is if I'm anyone who has a meeting with President Trump, the first thing I do is hit record on my phone before I walk into that room, right? I mean, that's to start with. I mean, because pretty clearly that could be really important. Although apparently President Trump might be hitting record too, as we may find out at some point. I guess the more to the point of the story, I I do not like Jeff Sessions in terms of his policies. I mean, I think his policies are horrifically misguided. I think he's going to be a colossally bad attorney general, taking us in exactly the wrong direction. That said, I don't think that he in any way is in collusion or had been in collusion with the Russians. I find that strains credulity. You know, people can be decent, honorable people and just have incredibly different views about what's in the public good. And I think that's where Jeff Sessions and I differ. And there are some people who argue that he's a racist and so forth. I don't believe that. I won't even get into that. But in any case, that part of it, I don't think there's a whole lot there. As for the other part that you mentioned, the why Jeff Sessions so frustrated his former colleagues in the Senate by, claiming, not really claiming executive privilege, but wanting to preserve that possibility for the president. To me, that's exactly the sort of thing as president that you would want a loyal appointee to do. If I'm the president, that's exactly what I want my attorney general to say, as little as possible, right? So while I can understand it being frustrating, I think Jeff Sessions, is, for better or worse, is being a good soldier, a loyal Trump appointee. But honestly, I don't think there's a whole lot there with that. And we'll find out with the investigation maybe in a few years or something like that, what's really there. But to me, as is so often the case with these things, it's not going to be about the crime, the so-called, the alleged crime, who knows, but it's going to be more about the cover up, the obstruction of justice, which apparently now the leaks say that, that Mueller is investigating, and rightly so. So I think that to me is more the story. And I think that Jeff Sessions did, by his lights, the right thing. And if it were a Democratic president and a Democratic attorney general, I would hope that that person would do the same sort of thing. Now, of course, Jeff Sessions can be compelled to testify and can be held in contempt of Congress if he doesn't. But I don't see things going to that point.
And that's an interesting question because, I mean, do you think that this kind of bespeaks a larger point that presidents. I mean, in political science, for our listeners, for a long time we have moved away from what we'd call congressional government to presidential government. And do you think these kinds of moments where you have the White House or a White House delegate basically flaunting a little bit of the investigatory powers of Congress and Congress not really being able to push back, is that sign of that kind of broader seep of power to the executive branch?
Well, yeah, and I think it's a sign of what we've seen for a long time now. Not so much that Congress is losing power, but Congress is choosing not to exercise its power for various reasons. Obviously, I think we get a very different reaction if the Senate were controlled by the Democrats than by the Republicans. But I mean, in many cases, I feel like Congress just chooses not to act as forcefully as it certainly could. As I pointed out, Congress certainly could compel Sessions to testify, could force the issue, but they are choosing not to do that.
Right. Now, and I think that's kind of an interesting broader story about, as you noted, Congress not activating its powers, right? It kind of has these latent abilities to do things, but they choose not to do it, I think, primarily for reelection purposes.
Yeah.
Um, but now, I think one last kind of really interesting point about the Sessions was that even when he was talking with some of his Republican, or he was getting questioned by some of the Republicans, so for instance, John McCain, he's going to get pushed to give details on a number of meetings, especially his September meeting, and Sessions just keeps saying, "I don't recall, I don't know, maybe, I don't recall." Do you think that's going to come back to be a bigger issue? Because that just seems unlikely that there are this many things about which he has nothing to say.
I think if you're a smart and cautious person, and I think that Jeff Sessions probably ticks both those boxes, the safe thing to say is you don't recall because no one can really prove that you recall when you didn't. And the less you say, the less you're likely to potentially incriminate yourself or get your boss in hot water down the line. So, and also as an attorney, of course, he knows how valuable I don't recall is as an answer. So maybe he doesn't recall, maybe he does, but I think he could at least technically say, well, I don't exactly recall. And he's not going to say, well, I don't recall, but here's kind of what I vaguely remember about this. And let me just kind of talk for a while. I mean, that's what his boss does. That's what Donald Trump does. And that's why this is so much of an issue right now, is because Donald Trump doesn't know when to shut the heck up. And Jeff Sessions does. So this wouldn't even be nearly the issue it is if Donald Trump could keep his mouth shut. But of course, he can't. I think Jeff Sessions is a lot smarter, a lot more politically savvy than the President of the United States, and he's trying to do what he can to limit the damage. Because even though I don't know that he's a huge fan of Donald Trump per se, he sees this, like I think a lot of other conservative Republicans, as an opportunity to get into office and to make things happen and to convince this political newcomer who seems to be interested more just in winning than in actual policy, to use him as a vessel to advance one's own agenda. And if just Jeff Sessions can do that and bring back the criminal justice policies of the 1970s and 1980s, I think he's going to count that as a win, though I think the country will count that as a big loss.
And that kind of, and what's fascinating about that, though, is you start talking about Trump with Sessions. I mean, the fact that Trump can't keep his Twitter mouth shut, um, do you think this then sets up the position where, I mean, so if you're Sessions and we take this reading and he's doing the smart lawyer thing, and Trump just can't keep tweeting about it, does this set Sessions or other White House officials up for serious problems in the future that probably won't eventually come to Trump's doorstep, but to their doorstep? So if something comes out, if he tweets something else and suddenly it looks like he can recall or something's held back, does this put Sessions in a dangerous location? And I mean, do you think that the rest of the White House is thinking very carefully about, well, if I take these open positions in a Senate committee hearing, what's going to happen if, who knows when, Trump launches another bomb on Twitter?
Yeah, I mean, I think that people in the administration have learned, if they didn't know already, that while Donald Trump expects, maybe demands loyalty from his people, it is not a two-way street with him. He is more than willing to throw his own people under the bus and has done so on a number of occasions. You add that with the fact that he is does not control himself very well, seems to lack that ability, that is a dangerous sort of thing. And so, there are a lot of people who I think are treading very cautiously because they know that the president won't support them, won't have their back, and they're going to, I think, kind of follow Sessions' lead and try to say, if they're smart, say as little as possible to potentially either incriminate themselves or to anger their boss and get him to lash out at them. So I think that's certainly no way to run an administration or any kind of organization when you're the person at the top, just basically saying, well, I'm not going to support you, and I might just say wild stuff that contradicts what I told you to say earlier. So I mean, and it goes back to something we've talked about for a while now, is that for all this talk about what a great business person Donald Trump is he has no ability to run a large and involved organization with a lot of people dealing with a lot of different areas. I mean, I think he's a disaster at that, and that's the kind of skill set you need to be an effective administrator, and he's not that. So, as a liberal, I think that's a great thing. There's people saying, "Well, look, is there anything we can do to get Donald Trump to stop tweeting?" I'm like, no, let's get him to tweet. In fact, let's get him to try to fire Robert Mueller. That would be awesome, because he would just be shooting himself and the conservative agenda in the foot. And I say, go for it, Donald Trump. Tweet, fire, be yourself, man.
Well, before we leave that topic and move forward, I'm going to say I'm actually going to take you up on a little bet on this one, Michael. I mean, now firing is a little different, but I think his tweeting, as much as our listeners might know that I'm not a big fan of it, I actually think it's one of the reasons that he's been relatively successful. So if I was on the left, I'm not sure if I'd be telling him to tweet all the time. We might need to.
Okay. Well, I
But
guess I see what you're saying, and I guess I'll make a distinction. I'll say that certainly it helps him with his base, but his base is 30 something, low 40s kind of percent. Those people aren't going anywhere, but that's not going to be enough for him to be successful in a policy sense, successful legislatively. So if he wants to just keep on pleasing that far right kind of base, well, then that's fine. That's great. Those people will support him to the very bitter end. But if he actually wants to get things done, if he wants to be a winner and not some horribly impotent, unsuccessful loser of a president, well, then that's not going to work for him.
if you keep calling him impotent, though, he might respond to you on Twitter.
Yeah,
I just want to
yeah,
point that out.
let's hope so. Impotent, small hands, whatever.
Why
I
don't we
won't
turn
even
our
do it.
attentions for a minute over to the Fed rate hike. On Wednesday, the Federal Reserve raised short-term interest rates by 1/4 point. That's actually going to be the third rate hike since December. This is a big sign that the Fed believes the U.S. economic conditions are good and improving. As a matter of fact, Janet Yellen is going to say, quote, "It reflects the progress the economy has made." So right now they're shooting for that top and bottom interest rate range to be between 1% and 1.25%. And that's actually a pretty dramatic increase when you remember that we've been in 2008, we were at 0%, a little bit unprecedented there. And for our listeners, just to give a little bit of an idea, because I know the Federal Reserve can be a confusing thing. The Federal Reserve Bank is a group of interrelated private corporations that are independent of the U.S., and they control the movement of money in the U.S. system. Primarily, they control the amount of money available to circulate, and they deal with kind of they have two big tools to set this interest rate range. One is ominously called the IOER, which is the interest on excess reserves. That's the amount of money that large banks can get from the Fed. It's one of their primary tools. And the other is the reverse repo, which is a way for mortgage banks to get money, and it kind of sets the floor for the interest rate. And so using those two tools, they try to move the interest rate. So obviously, this has a lot of implications, not just for you personally, but for the economy as a whole. So, what do you think this increase, this now pattern of increase, means, Mike? And do you think it's a good thing? Do you think that this signals that we got some good economic conditions going on? And how does that kind of relate to the broader political environment?
Well, I think certainly when we talk about what a healthy economy is, and certainly the Fed raises interest rates when they when they're concerned that maybe there's a possibility of growth being a little too fast. But it's a weird thing, right? Because it's sort of like trying to turn around an ocean liner, because what the Fed does doesn't have immediate effects. And also, the information that the Fed acts on is not like to the moment. It's economic data that is by its very nature a reflection of what things were like in the recent past and not right now. So it's incredibly difficult, the job that they have. But but in terms of what they look for, well, obviously, what do we mean when we say a healthy economy? Well, I think there are at least three components to that, right? The first is full employment, and we're pretty much at full employment right now. And what that means is, between 4 and 5% unemployment. And that's just because of natural kind of job churn and that sort of thing. And that looks really good. And that's one of the things that the Fed pointed to, right? The second thing is inflation. And most people would say, well, we don't want any inflation, right? But actually, no. If inflation gets too low, you start to have that danger of running into a deflationary spiral, and that is just disastrous for a whole bunch of reasons. And so the Fed shoots for around 2%. But if you have that inflation, you also want to make sure that wage growth keeps pace with that or is slightly ahead. And right now, wage growth is right around 3% or so. And if you're really geeky, go to the Atlanta Fed's website. They have this wage growth tracker thing that is really, really cool. I'm kind of geeky on the Fed stuff. But anyway, so we have two of these three things, I think, going in the right direction. We have decent wage growth. We have a really low rate of unemployment. But inflation is a little bit lower than the Fed would like. And they've been systematically underrating this. They keep on saying, well, we think it's going to pick up, but it hasn't. And that's a sign of an economy that is not growing as quickly as we would like to see. And that's been a problem, of course, since the recovery. And this recovery has been now, I believe, 9 years now. So it's been a long recovery, but it's been an incredibly slow recovery. And now there are some people who are saying that, well, this is just a new normal. This is what we got to expect. And looking back to the 90s when we had 3 to 4% growth rates per year, that's not going to happen anymore. And this is just kind of how things are. So I think it's a smart move, if for no other reason than if, you mentioned that the rate now is between what,
1 and
1.25.
1.25, yeah.
If you keep that rate bottomed out, then that takes away a tool from the Fed if we go into a recession, because they can't use that to kind of stimulate the economy if we're already full out. So I think that makes sense. It frees up more options in the future. The other part of it, that the Fed announced is that they were going to be pulling back some of their positions in the bond market. Basically, that's another way of taking money out of the economy. And again, I think this was something that they have been telegraphing for a long time. The markets reacted in a fairly sedate way to this since it was so well telegraphed. It makes sense to me. The underlying issue to me is, well, is this going to put the brakes on already slow economic growth? Then maybe a little bit. God knows the Fed has been wrong before in the past. Certainly in the mid 2000s they were. I guess I sort of trust Janet Yellen on this. So she's has a background as a labor market economist and knows her stuff. And so I think this is a smart, kind of judicious move by the Fed.
No, I mean, I think it definitely indicates that the Fed thinks that the economy is doing better. And ironically, this is one of the areas where what everybody kind of thinks and believes can actually push an economy in the right direction, right? Because if the market is just a bunch of people feeling confident in buying things. And
Right.
so if people think they should be more confident and they act more confident, that creates a feedback loop in that sense. Um, But obviously, I'm going to be a little bit more skeptical of the Federal Reserve than you are,
Sure.
Mike. Being the good libertarian that I am, and I worry about the Fed's use of its monetary policy because as you kind of rightfully note, when you start making these kinds of changes, it can be very difficult to see what the long-term impact will be. And in a world where consumer spending right now is still pretty low, when these trickle down to, say, your credit card rates, I can imagine that this is going to have some consumer spending changes as well. It worries me a little bit. I mean, not in a giant way,
Well,
but
it's interesting. One thing I wanted to ask you about, and as you know, and I'm sure listeners may know, that in the wake of the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, the Federal Reserve literally created trillions of dollars of money, put that money into the economy. And one of the big concerns that a lot of folks on the right, and I think a lot of libertarians had, I don't want to necessarily assume those two groups are the same, because in many cases they are. I don't want to get you upset, but the assumption was that this could create the potential for serious inflation down the line when you throw all this money into the economy. And yet, it seems like the problem we're having is exactly the opposite problem, that inflation is maybe a little bit too low, which is kind of I don't think that a lot of conservatives would have if they would have been asked, say, well, what's the effect of this going to be 5, 10 years down the line? They wouldn't say, well, I think it's going to, inflation's going to be well below 2%. They would have, there were people saying, we could have 5, 10, even hyperinflation. It could be awful, and that hasn't come to pass for various reasons.
well, I will say, and and this is going to, you talking about the left, some of the left getting after you. This might anger some of my libertarian friends, but I think those of us on the right, while I think we're right to be skeptical of things like the Federal Reserve, I think that this can often take a bunker mentality. I get tired of the continual libertarian refrain. Next year's the year when the money's going to go out of circulation, and if you don't have gold, it's all going to be over. We're going to hit
Right.
hyperinflation. um, and then that's just not there is no evidence to believe that that's the way monetary policy happens in the United States. So even if you're going to have issue with it, I think you make a good critical point of at least the libertarian position, where I think oftentimes we really do kind of have that bunker mentality that says we know what will eventually happen. Well, bad policy doesn't necessarily mean cataclysmic, apocalyptic
Yeah.
scenarios, and I think we tend to take that view too way far too often.
Yeah, and that I would argue that's not something that just libertarians do, but the right and the so it's not just you guys, but I think it's important, and it can be really useful to have some sort of broad theoretical model for how politics works, how markets and how the world works. I found that incredibly useful, but also I think on a regular basis you need to check that model with empirical data you have. And instead of coming up with some bizarre sort of system, saying, well, if we look at this in this weird way and cherry pick these 12 things, that my model still sort of works. Sometimes you need to adjust your theoretical model based on the reality, and that can be hard for anyone to do. Not just libertarians. Certainly, I would argue that we talked about environmental issues a lot on the show, and I would argue that an article of faith for a lot of folks on my side of things, the left, is that nuclear power is horrible and evil and so forth. And I would argue that this is the sort of thing where the evidence might suggest that we might need to recalibrate that viewpoint that has become sort of an article of faith on the left. So there are examples all the way around, but I think that's just the general point, important thing to keep in mind.
And it's a really hard thing to do.
Oh yeah.
When you talk with students, I'm sure you have these same kind of conversations. When you're talking about social behavior sciences, which is what we do, it's always difficult because, nobody's theory of chemistry. I mean, nobody sits around and says, "Oh, did you see this
Yeah.
in chemistry class the other day? Two oxygen models got together," and I'm like appalled by that.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah,
we don't have
exactly.
that issue. But in social science, we do have that issue because you're going to have people go, "Oh, he was talking about a woman and a woman getting together," or whatever it
Yeah.
happens to be. And so when you're talking about people, I think it's much more difficult to revise, to put your theory with data from the world, because it comes with not just the empirical side of that theory, but with all kinds of implicit, often normative biases.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So, well, why don't we finish up by talking about what we've been reading this week, Mike? As for me, actually, I just got a new book. I'm about halfway through it, and I really highly recommend it to my readers. It's Andrew Roberts' Napoleon: A Life. It's a really gripping biography on Napoleon. It's one of the best single volume biographies on him I've read. And what's really cool about it is recently, a lot of additional documentation on Napoleon, especially letters, have come to life. I'm talking about tens of thousands of new original source materials now available, and Roberts has incorporated all of this into his single volume. As a matter of fact, it's the only single volume to have all of that new material as part of it. So it's a brand new kind of take and look at Napoleon in that era. And so that's what I'm reading right now. I'm about halfway through, and I really highly recommend it to anybody who wants a kind of an in-depth look at the post Revolutionary War period, France or Napoleon.
Wow, that's this is really weird, and listeners, you might not believe this, but I did not know that Trey was going to suggest or recommend that book. But I kid you not, I finished. I actually picked up that book a while back and finished it maybe I don't know a month ago or so, and I was really impressed with it. I thought it was a great book. I highly recommend it. If you want to check to see that I'm actually being honest about that, you can go to my Goodreads page. I have a review up there on it saying great things about that. Is an excellent choice, a great biography. I'm a big fan of that book. I think I can definitely echo your recommendation on that.
How ironic. So
Isn't
what
that
you're
weird?
saying is we probably bought it at the same time and it was on different parts of our reading schedule.
There you go. Yeah, I mean, very, very, very weird. So, yeah, definitely a great book. So, here's what I'm reading this week, or what I recommend this week. It's much shorter. The Napoleon book is a big, long read, but definitely worth it. This will take you. My recommendation will take you maybe 10 minutes. It's an article entitled "Yes, Congress is Getting Less Smart. No, it's not Trump's fault," which I thought was a great title. It goes into detail about the importance of legislative staff and how congressional budget cuts have really diminished the kind of in-house expertise in Congress. And so, what happens when you lose your internal experts? Well, you become a lot more, not only do you become less able to craft solid, sensible, intelligent policy, but you also become much more likely to be influenced by outsiders. Because I guarantee you that lobbyists are not cutting back on that. The executive branch still has some really strong assets and resources. So, we've talked about earlier about Congress being at kind of a disadvantage in terms of the executive branch, in terms of power. Well, this is exactly the sort of penny wise, pound foolish thing. People say, "Oh, Congress spends too much money and they need to cut back." And recent Congresses have cut back on this sort of thing. That's exactly the kind of dumb cut that you don't want to see. What we want to do is make sure that Congress has good, strong, stronger than ever institutional capability to deal with these issues and to be a co-equal branch with the executive branch and to be able to, refute some of the very biased things that come from lobbyists. And this Congress is not in a great position to do that after years of budget cuts that really are not very smart. And so I think it was a great article about one of those sort of nuts and bolts kinds of things that, not at all sexy, but this is the kind of stuff that really matters in terms of the quality of policy that we get. And so I would really encourage people to check this out. I thought it was a great, really informative article, and like I said, a reasonably quick read, but not the sort of thing that you'll necessarily see on the front page of any publication.
Fascinating.
Yeah. So there we go. I think that pretty much leads us up to the end of this first episode with you in the driver's seat, Trey. What'd you think?
It's been a lot of fun taking this side. How's it been being the interviewee?
I gotta say, I loved it. It was freeing. I think I was probably a little more kind of just off the cuff and maybe a little more radical. I don't know. I definitely want to hear. I think it'll be great to hear what listeners think about that. So, folks, if you have any thoughts, and I'm sure you do, we have a great opinionated bunch of listeners. Definitely let us know. I had a lot of fun with this tree. I know you had a lot of fun with it, right?
Yes.
And so we plan on doing this. So let us know what you think. So that is actually it for this episode. And of course, thanks everyone for listening. And we also want to thank our sponsors again for this week. First is SeatGeek, where Politics Guys listeners get $20 off their first purchase. Just download the app, or you can go to the website, SeatGeek.com, enter promo code PoliticsGuy, that's one word, no S, and you get $20 off your first purchase. And Dollar Shave Club, where for a limited time only, new members get the first month of the Executive Razor with the tube of Dr. Carver's shave butter. I don't know who Dr. Carver is, but he makes great shave butter. It could be a she. I was just a sexist assumption there. But anyway, check it out. Only $5 with free shipping. Go to dollarshaveclub.com/TPG. And if you've got questions, comments, corrections, random thoughts, you want to reach me, Trey, Jay, anyone really, mail at politicsguys.com, or hit us up on our Facebook page where we post stuff throughout the week, facebook.com/politicsguys page. And we're also on Twitter at politicsguys. And, we really appreciate our great listeners who have generously supported the show through their donations. If you'd like to join them, you can do that through the Patreon or PayPal links on our website, politicsguys.com. And if money's tight, you're already a financial supporter, we hope you'll consider hitting that share icon on your podcast app to pass this episode along to your friends, followers, crew, whatever, and leaving ratings and reviews of the show on your app, sharing and retweeting our new show posts and tweets. That also is really, really helpful, and we would appreciate it if you do that. So that wraps it up for this week. We will be back with a new show next week. We hope you'll join us.